The rain tapped softly against the old windows of the Brooklyn house, extroplet whispering like a secret Isabella Peterson had heard too many times before that she didn't belong here. At 21, her life had already been stripped bare by loss and loneliness. Her parents' accident had taken not only their lives, but her sense of safety, her laughter, and every dream she had once dared to hold close. Living with her uncle and aunt had been less a refuge and more a quiet captivity. They never failed to remind her how burdensome she was, how much she owed, and how little she would ever become. Yet even in the heaviness of her life there remained something unbroken within her. A small, flickering strength that refused to die, a belief that one day she would find her purpose beyond the walls of this cruel household. That morning, as she tied her apron for another long shift at the bakery, her aunt's voice cut through the silence like the crack of a whip. "Isabella, come down here now." The tone was different, sharper, decisive, as though a final judgment had already been passed. When she entered the kitchen, the air felt charged. Her Uncle Robert's heavy frame stood by the window, his jaw tight, as if containing anger or anticipation. Her Aunt Sharon sat with folded hands and eyes that gleamed not with affection, but with calculation. Isabella sensed instinctively that something irreversible was about to happen. "Sit down," Robert ordered. The chair felt cold beneath her palms as she obeyed, her heart pounding in her chest. "You're 21 now," Sharon began, her voice detached, as if reciting a business transaction rather than speaking to family. "You've lived here long enough. You've eaten our food, used our home, and given very little in return. We've found a way for you to stop being a burden." The words struck like thunder. "I work every day," Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. "I give you everything I earn." Her uncle's lips curved in a humorless smile. "And that covers what?" "The meals, the roof, the clothes on your back. You've been nothing but an expense." Then came the blow, the one she hadn't been prepared for. "There's a man," Sharon continued, sliding a folded document across the table as if signing away property. "He's very wealthy. He's agreed to marry you." Isabella froze, her mind unable to process what she was hearing. "Marry me," she breathed. "To a stranger?" Robert crossed his arms. "Not just any man. Ethan Montgomery. He owns half of Manhattan. He's worth billions. You'll never have to worry again." The name sounded distant, almost unreal, like something from the business headlines she'd once glimpsed while delivering pastries downtown. Ethan Montgomery, a man rumored to be ruthless in boardrooms, but charitable toward the poor. A man who built skyscrapers that touched the clouds. Yet none of that mattered. "I don't know him," she whispered, panic swelling in her chest. "You don't need to," her aunt snapped. "You just need to be grateful. The arrangements are done. His people will pick you up tomorrow." Robert leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "This is your chance, Isabella. You'll finally have a purpose. Don't ruin it." That night, she lay awake in the small attic room, her thoughts spinning between fear and disbelief. How could anyone decide her fate so easily? Was she truly so powerless that her life could be sold like a debt? Yet beneath the fear was an unexpected spark, a question she couldn't ignore. Why would a billionaire want her? She was no socialite, no heiress. Just a tired girl who smelled of bread and sugar after long bakery shifts. The thought that someone like Ethan Montgomery had chosen her seemed absurd. And yet the next morning, when a black limousine stopped outside the worn-down house, reality struck like lightning. The man who stepped out introduced himself as David Chen, Ethan's personal assistant. Polite, immaculate, efficient. "Miss Peterson," he said with a small bow. "Mr. Montgomery asked that I accompany you to his estate for your preparation."
Oh.
The words felt rehearsed, almost mechanical, but his tone carried an unexpected warmth. "You needn't worry," he added softly, as though sensing her unease. "Mr. Montgomery's a good man." Isabella's eyes searched his face for any sign of deceit, but all she saw was sincerity. With trembling hands, she packed the few belongings she owned, a locket with her mother's picture, 2 worn paperbacks, and a faded notebook filled with her secret writings. As the car pulled away, she glanced back one last time at the house that had never been a home. The city blurred past in silver streaks of rain and neon. Each mile carried her farther from the life she had known and closer to a destiny she couldn't yet understand. When the car finally stopped before an iron gate guarded by stone lions, Isabella's breath caught. The Montgomery estate rose beyond it, not a house, but a palace of glass and marble that reflected the clouds above. She followed David through vast corridors lined with art and quiet. Opulence, until they reached a grand sitting room where a fire burned gently in the hearth. "Mr. Montgomery will see you shortly," David said before retreating. Left alone, Isabella wandered to the window. The skyline stretched in the distance, glittering like 1,000 promises. Her reflection stared back, a young woman caught between fear and fascination. When the door opened behind her, she turned sharply. The man who entered was taller than she expected, his presence filling the room before he spoke. Ethan Montgomery was the kind of man who carried silence like armor, measured, composed, powerful. His dark hair was touched with silver, his eyes a stormy gray that seemed to see more than they revealed. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then Ethan's voice, deep and steady, broke the quiet. "Miss Peterson." Isabella managed to feint Mr. Montgomery. He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I realize the circumstances of our engagement are unconventional," he began, walking slowly toward the fireplace. "But I want you to know that I never meant for this to feel like a transaction. I understand that your uncle approached me in desperation, and I made an offer that perhaps I should have reconsidered. Still, I gave my word, and I intend to honor it." But he turned, his eyes meeting hers. "This marriage will happen only if you agree to it." The words struck her speechless. She had expected command, not choice. "If I agree?" she repeated softly. "Yes." His voice was calm, but sincere. "I will not force you. You deserve at least that freedom." For the first time in days, Isabella felt the heavy knot in her chest loosen slightly. "Why me?" she asked at last, her voice trembling. Ethan smiled faintly, not with arrogance, but with something closer to sadness. "Because when I saw your photograph, I recognized a loneliness I've known my whole life. I thought perhaps we could both stop being alone." It was such a simple answer, yet it pierced straight through her defenses. That evening, as she sat in the guest suite prepared for her, Isabella couldn't stop replaying his words. She had expected cruelty, but found compassion. She had expected a captor, but found a man who offered her a choice. It didn't erase her fear, but it planted something new inside her: curiosity, even hope. The following days unfolded in quiet grace. Designers and planners came and went, yet Ethan never once interfered or imposed. Each time Isabella tried to speak with him, he treated her not as a possession, but as a partner, asking her opinion, listening carefully. When she hesitated to choose her dress, he smiled and said, "Whatever makes you feel most yourself." When the wedding day finally arrived, the church shimmered with soft light and white roses. As she walked down the aisle, her breath caught at the sight of him waiting tall, composed but with eyes that softened the moment they met hers. And when he spoke his vows, promising patience and kindness instead of authority, Isabella felt tears gather unbidden. That night, in the quiet of their new home, high above Manhattan's glowing skyline, Ethan led her into a suite filled with warmth and candlelight, but no pressure. "This is your home," he said simply. "No expectations. Only trust when you're ready." The gentleness in his voice undid her. For the first time in years, someone had given her time instead of demands. She whispered, "Thank you," and meant it more deeply than any words she had ever spoken. Later, when she sat alone by the window, watching the city lights flicker like stars below, she opened her notebook and wrote, "Maybe love doesn't always begin with passion or choice. Maybe sometimes it begins with kindness." The first morning, Isabella awoke as Mrs. Montgomery. Sunlight spilled through the panoramic glass walls of the penthouse, painting the floor in soft gold. The city stretched endlessly below her, alive and glittering, stark contrast to the dull gray skyline she had known in Brooklyn. For a long moment, she simply sat at the edge of her bed, breathing in the scent of roses that seemed to fill every corner of the apartment. It didn't feel real yet, not the ceremony, not the vows, and certainly not the man who had spoken to her the night before with such quiet compassion that her heart still trembled at the memory. Ethan had not so much as touched her hand after leading her to the guest room. Instead, he had told her, "You owe me nothing but honesty, Isabella. Be yourself, that's all I ask." It was the kind of respect she hadn't experienced in years, maybe ever, and it both comforted and confused her. She had prepared herself for submission, but not for kindness. Days passed, each one revealing something new about the man she had married. Ethan's schedule was disciplined: breakfast at 8, office meetings until evening, and quiet dinners where he would listen more than he spoke. Isabella had expected arrogance, but what she found was a man burdened by the weight of solitude. His wealth surrounded him with people, yet he seemed untouched by any real connection. One evening, she found him sitting alone in his study, staring out at the skyline. Papers and reports lay scattered across the desk, yet his gaze wasn't on them. "You work too much," she said gently, surprised by her own courage. He turned, a rare smile touching his lips. "Habit. When you've built your life from nothing, it's hard to stop building." She stepped closer, drawn not by duty but by curiosity. "And does all that building make you happy?" Ethan's smile faded, replaced by a look of deep introspection. "Success fills the world around you," he said softly, "but happiness fills the heart. I'm still learning the difference." It was the first time Isabella truly saw him, not the billionaire whose signature could shift markets, but the man behind the walls, weary from a lifetime of conquest. That night, when she returned to her room, she found herself thinking not of fear, but of understanding. Maybe they were both lost souls who had found each other by accident. And maybe, just maybe, that accident had purpose. As weeks turned into months, their relationship deepened in quiet, unspoken ways. They shared dinners that began as polite conversation and ended in laughter. Ethan took her to his favorite art gallery, where he admitted, almost shyly, that he found peace in the colors of impressionist paintings. Isabella, in turn, confessed her love of literature, of stories where ordinary people found extraordinary courage. "You know," he said one afternoon as they walked through Central Park, "you remind me of those characters, the ones who endure everything yet still find light." She smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm not strong, Ethan. I just keep going because I have to." He stopped walking then, his gaze steady and sincere. That's what strength really is. Slowly, the boundaries between them began to fade. Ethan would wait for her at breakfast, pouring her coffee before his own. Isabella began visiting his office in the evenings, bringing him tea and sitting silently nearby as he worked. Sometimes they spoke of trivial things, the weather, a new book she had read, and other times of their pasts. He told her about growing up in foster care, about sleeping in cars and working night shifts until he could afford college. She shared stories of her parents, how her father would dance with her mother in the kitchen every Sunday morning. There were two broken lives stitched together by shared silence and small confessions. And through it all, Isabella found herself changing. The timid girl who once trembled before every decision was slowly rediscovering the voice she had lost. One rainy evening, when thunder rumbled across the sky and the world outside was painted in silver streaks of lightning, Isabella found Ethan standing by the window again, his expression distant. She approached him quietly. "You always stand here when it rains," she said. "Why?" Ethan's eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "Because rain washes everything clean. It reminds me that even the sky can cry." His words were heavy with emotion, and before she could stop herself, she reached for his hand. He looked down at their joined fingers, surprised but not pulling away. "Ethan," she whispered, "you don't have to be alone anymore." He turned toward her, his eyes meeting hers with a tenderness that stole her breath. "Neither do you, Isabella." That night, as they sat together on the couch, the storm raging beyond the glass, Ethan told her something he had never told anyone. "When I agreed to marry you, I thought I was rescuing you," he said quietly. "But you've been the one rescuing me." The confession made her chest tighten. She wanted to speak, to tell him what he had come to mean to her, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she rested her head on his shoulder. And for the first time, they sat together not as strangers bound by circumstance, but as two hearts finding home in each. Others' silence. By the third month, Isabella's presence had transformed the penthouse. The once sterile rooms now breathed warmth and color, books on the tables, a piano in the corner where she practiced late at night. Soft laughter that echoed through the halls. Ethan's employees noticed the change too. He smiled more, worked less, and even allowed himself the luxury of weekends away from the office. They spent one such weekend at his lake house upstate, serene retreat surrounded by pine trees and water that shimmered like glass. Isabella had never seen such beauty. "It's peaceful here," she murmured, standing at the edge of the dock as the breeze played with her hair. Ethan joined her, slipping off his shoes. "It used to feel empty," he said, "but now it feels alive." That evening, they cooked together in the small kitchen, laughing over burned toast and spilled flour. For the first time in her life, Isabella felt the kind of joy that came without fear, pure, simple, and unearned. Later, they sat by the fireplace, wrapped in a shared silence that said everything words could not. Isabella glanced at him, her heart swelling with something she no longer wished to deny. "Ethan," she said softly, "do you ever regret it, choosing me?" He turned toward her, his expression gentle. "Every empire I built, every deal I made, all of it feels meaningless compared to the day you walked into my life." "No, Isabella. You're the first decision I've never doubted." The words ignited something deep within her, not passion in the worldly sense, but love in its purest form, trust, admiration, gratitude. It was then she realized that love wasn't something you fell into. It was something you grew into, day by day, through kindness and understanding. She reached for his hand and whispered, "Then let's stop living in the past. Let's build something real, together." Ethan's eyes glistened and he squeezed her hand gently. "Together?" he agreed. Months later, their bond had become unshakable. Isabella began studying business at university, with Ethan's quiet encouragement. Determined to find her own place in the world. "You don't owe me a life," he had told her. "You deserve to build your own." She did, not because he demanded it, but because he believed she could. Her confidence grew. Her laughter returned. And one evening, as they celebrated her first published article in a financial journal, Isabella looked at Ethan across the candlelit table and realized that she was no longer the frightened girl sold into marriage. She was a woman who had learned her worth because someone had finally seen it. That night, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the glittering Manhattan skyline, the city humming softly beneath them, Ethan took her hand and said, "You've changed my world, Isabella. I used to think love was something that weakened men. Now I see it's the only thing that gives us strength." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude, not sorrow. "And you've shown me that being loved doesn't mean being owned," she said softly. "It means being free together." In the months and years that followed, they built not just a marriage but a partnership, one rooted in respect, compassion, and shared dreams. Isabella helped expand Ethan's foundation for orphaned children, dedicating herself to giving others the opportunities she never had. Ethan, in turn, rediscovered life's simpler joys, the sound of laughter in his home, the warmth of family dinners, the peace of knowing he was finally loved for who he was, not what he owned. And on one quiet evening years later, as the two of them sat by the lake where it had all begun, watching the reflection of the stars ripple on the water's surface, Isabella leaned against him and whispered, "You once said you wanted to stop being alone. Do you still feel that way?" Ethan smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No," he said softly, "because you taught me that love isn't something we wait for. It's something we choose. Every day." She smiled back, her eyes shimmering with the same courage and hope that had carried her through every trial. "Then let's keep choosing it," she said. And as the night wrapped around them like a promise, the rain began to fall again, gentle, cleansing, endless, washing away every trace of loneliness that had ever been. Asterisk. The years that followed seemed to glide like sunlight across the calm surface of a lake, smooth on the outside yet carrying unseen depths beneath. Isabella had grown into her role not as the wife of a billionaire, but as the woman who had quietly transformed an empire with her heart. What had begun as an arranged union built on uncertainty had become a partnership rooted in understanding, laughter, and a shared longing to make their lives mean something beyond the walls of luxury. Ethan's world, once driven by ambition and numbers, had been rewritten by her presence. She had shown him that the true value of success was not in the towers he built, but in the lives he could lift. Together they founded the Montgomery Foundation, a vast network of schools, orphanage programs, and shelters for women who had lost their way, women like Isabella once was, broken by circumstance yet waiting for one act of kindness to ignite hope again. Years later, when the world called them a symbol of grace and endurance, Isabella often reflected on how far they had come. She still remembered the frightened girl who had stood before her uncle's kitchen table, powerless and uncertain. That girl had been sold into a life she hadn't chosen, yet had emerged as a woman who reshaped destiny with courage and faith. "Do you ever think about the past?" she asked Ethan one evening as they sat in their garden watching their daughter chase fireflies. He smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Only to remind myself how lucky I am that the universe was kind enough to bring you to me." She rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of a heart that once beat only for ambition and now pulsed with love. "And I remind myself," she said softly, "that every storm, no matter how fierce, can lead us to sunlight if we don't give up." Theirs became a story told not in headlines or fairy tales, but in quiet whispers, the kind of story that reminded people that love, when built on kindness and patience, can transform even the coldest walls into a home. In their twilight years, when time had silvered their hair and softened their voices, they often returned to the lake house where it had all begun. The world outside had changed, but within that sanctuary, nothing had. One evening, as the sun melted into gold over the water, Ethan turned to her with a smile that carried the weight of decades. "You remember that day? The day you told me you wanted it now? Not riches, not luxury, but life, love, freedom?" Isabella laughed softly, her eyes shining. "Yes, and you gave it to me not by making me yours, but by letting me be myself." He took her hand, weathered yet warm, and whispered, "You made me human again." Isabella, as the stars began to appear, they sat in silence, the air filled with the scent of pine and memory. Their daughter's laughter echoed faintly from the garden, a reminder that love's legacy outlives the lovers themselves. And when the first raindrop fell, just as it had on the night they met, Isabella smiled and looked toward the heavens. "It's raining again," she murmured. Ethan squeezed her hand. "Maybe the sky just wants to thank us." She leaned against him, eyes closing in peaceful surrender, knowing that their story, born of pain, forged in patience, and crowned with purpose, had become something eternal. The rain fell harder, wrapping the world in silver, and from their porch overlooking the quiet lake, the two souls who had once lived in loneliness watched the heavens open with gratitude. Their journey had begun with fear, but it ended with faith, the faith that love, when nurtured with respect and forgiveness, can turn even a transaction into a destiny. And as the years continued to unfold like gentle waves, their names became not symbols of wealth, but of a truth far greater, that hearts healed by kindness can change the world. Asterisk. Time moved gently through the Montgomery estate, the seasons shifting across its gardens like pages in a living book. Years had layered themselves quietly over the lives of Ethan and Isabella Montgomery, softening the lines on their faces, but not the fire in their hearts. Their daughter Grace had grown into a young woman whose kindness mirrored her mother's and whose quiet intelligence reflected her father's. From the time she could walk, she had followed Isabella into classrooms and shelters. Listening to the stories of women rebuilding their lives, she had seen firsthand that love, when translated into service, became the purest form of power. Ethan watched her often from his study window, pride filling his chest as he realized that the legacy he had once imagined in numbers and buildings had instead taken shape. In the heart of his child, Grace was 21 now. Same age Isabella had been when her own life had changed forever, and with that age came a restlessness familiar to both her parents. She wanted to step into the world on her own terms, to prove that compassion could thrive even outside the safety of the Montgomery name. When she announced that she wished to move abroad for a year to help build schools in remote villages, Ethan's instinct was to protest. The idea of his daughter, his miracle, living far from his protection terrified him. But Isabella placed a gentle hand on his arm and said, "We built all of this to teach her freedom. Now we have to let her live it." Those words, spoken with the calm certainty that had guided him through decades of storms, melted the resistance in Ethan's heart. He nodded slowly, and together they helped Grace prepare for the journey that would test everything they had taught her. The night before she left, the three of them sat by the lake house fire, the same hearth that had witnessed the beginning of Ethan and Isabella's own transformation. Grace leaned against her mother's shoulder as her father watched the flames dance. "Dad," she said quietly, "what if I fail? What if I'm not strong enough?" Ethan reached over and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch filled with pride and tenderness. "You'll fail many times," he said, "and that's exactly how you'll become strong enough. Your mother taught me that the measure of love isn't perfection. It's persistence." Isabella smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "Go build something beautiful, my love. Not for the world's applause, but for the sound of one child laughing because of you."
Nate.
Under a sky scattered with stars, Grace promised herself she would make them proud. Months later, letters and video calls carried snippets of her adventures. Stories of classrooms rising from red earth, of children learning their first words in the flickering light of lanterns, of communities finding hope again. Isabella listened to every detail with awe, her heart swelling at the sight of the young woman who embodied everything she and Ethan had fought to create. Yet with each message came a quiet ache of longing, the ache every parent feels when love must stretch across oceans. Ethan buried himself in his work again, not for profit, but to fund the growing foundation Grace had inspired. The house, though full of art and laughter, felt incomplete without her. On restless nights, he would walk the halls until he found Isabella in the nursery that had once been Grace's. Standing by the window, as if listening to echoes of lullabies long past, he would wrap his arms around her and whisper, "She's doing exactly what she was meant to do." And Isabella would nod, knowing it was true, even as her eyes glistened. 2 years later, Grace returned, not as the sheltered daughter who had left, but as a woman tempered by experience. Her hands bore faint scars from labor, her eyes the calm of someone who had seen suffering and chosen to meet it with love. At the airport, when Ethan saw her step through the crowd, his composure broke for the first time in years. He embraced her tightly, whispering, "You've done more than I ever dreamed." But Grace shook her head. "No, Dad. You and Mom did. I just followed your footsteps." That evening, the house filled with laughter again, and Isabella realized that every sacrifice, every trial, had led to this moment, 3 lives bound, not by blood alone, but by the purpose they had built together. As the family settled back into rhythm, life presented one last test. Ethan, now older and slower, began to show signs of illness. At first he brushed it aside as fatigue, but the truth could not be ignored. Isabella sat beside him in the doctor's office, her fingers entwined with his, as the words "early-stage heart condition" hung in the air, like an invisible weight. For a man who had once commanded cities, the fragility of his own body was humbling. Yet rather than despair, Ethan felt an unexpected peace. He had spent half his life running from mortality, but now he faced it with gratitude, knowing that his time, however long it might be, had been lived fully. When they returned home, Grace met them at the door, and without a word, she took his other hand. The warmth of both women beside him made Ethan realize that love, not longevity, was the real victory. The months that followed were filled not with sadness, but with intention. Ethan slowed his business commitments, choosing instead to mentor young entrepreneurs through the foundation. He spoke often about ethics, compassion, and the duty of wealth to serve humanity. At night, Isabella would read to him from her old notebooks. It's the same ones she had kept in her youth, filled with reflections on survival and second chances. Sometimes Grace would sit nearby, sketching plans for new schools and programs. the next generation of their mission already taking root. The house, once a monument to ambition, had become a sanctuary of wisdom and memory. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the lake, casting ripples of gold across the water, Ethan sat with his wife and daughter on the porch. The air was heavy with the scent of rain, and the same clouds that had once mirrored his loneliness now seemed to promise renewal. He took Isabella's hand and said softly, "You remember the first time we stood here? I told you I wanted to stop being alone. Now I look at both of you and I realize I never truly understood what together meant until now." Isabella smiled through her tears, her voice steady. "And I never understood what strength meant until I saw you let go of control and let love guide you." Grace looked between them, her heart swelling with gratitude for the foundation they had given her. "You two built more than an empire," she said quietly. "You built a way of life." When the first drops of rain began to fall, the three of them remained seated, letting it soak into their hair and clothes. To outsiders, it might have seemed foolish, but to them, it was sacred, a reminder of every storm that had once shaped them. The lake shimmered beneath the gray sky, reflecting the light of their home, and the air buzzed with the soft sound of laughter mingling with thunder. Isabella leaned her head against Ethan's shoulder, Grace on his other side, and for a timeless moment the world felt complete. In the years that followed, Grace would go on to lead the foundation with the same compassion her parents had lived by. Ethan's health eventually failed, but his final moments were peaceful, surrounded by the people he loved most. His last words to Isabella were whispered against her ear as dawn broke over the lake. "Promise me you'll keep choosing life." And she did. She carried his message into every day that remained, teaching others that love is not a possession, but a continuous act of courage. When her own time finally came, many years later, she left behind not just an inheritance, but a philosophy that hearts healed through kindness will always outlive the hands that built the walls. And so the Montgomery story became a legend told in classrooms, charities, and homes around the world. It began with despair and ended with hope. It began with loneliness and became a symphony of compassion. At the lake house, which Grace kept as a retreat for young dreamers, a plaque still hangs by the porch where the three once sat together. It reads, "Love is the only wealth that grows when given away." Each visitor who reads it feels something stir in their chest, a small reminder that even in a world obsessed with power, the truest success lies in the quiet strength of a giving heart. Asterisk. The morning that opened Grace Montgomery's new chapter began with the hush of the lake still wrapped in mist. A quiet world that seemed to breathe with her as she stood on the porch her parents had loved so dearly. Years had passed since Ethan and Isabella had been laid to rest side by side beneath the willows, their graves marked not by marble but by a single bronze plaque that read, "Love is a living thing." Grace visited often, speaking to them in whispers, telling them about the foundation, the people she met, the schools she had built, and the children who now laughed because of them. Every time she spoke, she felt her mother's calm and her father's steady courage answering inside her own heartbeat. She was 30 now, wise beyond her years, carrying the gentleness of Isabella's compassion and the iron steadiness of Ethan's resolve. Under her direction, the Montgomery Foundation had become one of the largest humanitarian networks in the world, from the crowded streets of Manila to the silent plains of Kenya. Their emblem, a simple golden heart within a circle, had come to stand for opportunity, education, and dignity. Grace had learned early that compassion without structure faded quickly. So she built systems the way her father once built, skyscrapers, solid, transparent, lasting. She had no desire for the spotlight, yet people noticed her anyway, drawn to the calm conviction in her eyes and the quiet power of her voice. When journalists asked how she kept hope alive in a cynical world, she always gave the same answer, because love is work, not wishful thinking. But even the purest mission faces storms. One spring, a series of financial scandals shook the charity world, and whispers spread that even the Montgomery Foundation could not be trusted. Grace found herself standing before cameras defending everything her family had built. The reporters' flashes felt like lightning. Questions cut like knives. "What makes you any different from the rest?" One shouted. Grace straightened her back. her voice calm but firm. "Transparency," she said. "Every dollar is accounted for, and every life matters. We are not selling salvation. We are building futures." Her honesty turned suspicion into admiration, and within months, donations returned, stronger than ever. That trial taught her what her parents had always known, that integrity, though often tested, shines brightest when threatened. It was during those turbulent years that Grace met Daniel Herrera, a former war-zone journalist who had turned his lens from destruction toward rebuilding. He came to interview her about the Foundation's work in a drought-stricken region of South America. She had expected another polite reporter chasing headlines. But instead she found a man who asked not about numbers, but about meaning. "What keeps you from giving up when nothing seems to change?" he asked. Grace looked at him, her expression soft but unyielding. "Because somewhere a child still believes tomorrow will be kinder, and I refuse to prove them wrong." Daniel lowered his camera, speechless. Over the next months, he traveled with her team, capturing stories of hope rising from rubble and somewhere between dusty roads and starlit camps. Friendship deepened into something stronger. Yet Grace, cautious of the spotlight that came with her name, kept her heart guarded. She feared that love might distract her from duty, until one evening, Daniel said quietly, "Your parents didn't build all this so you could live half a life." The words settled inside her like truth when they eventually married. It was not in glittering halls, but beneath the open sky by the lake. The same place where Ethan had once promised Isabella that love would be chosen, not claimed. Only close friends, staff, and the children from their programs attended, their laughter floating across the water. Grace wore a simple ivory gown, her mother's pearl at her throat, and as she spoke her vows, she felt generations of faith guiding her tongue. "I promise," she said, "to build not walls of wealth, but bridges of kindness. I promise to stand with you in the storms and to share with you the sunlight," Daniel answered. "And I promise to hold the camera steady so the world never forgets what compassion looks like." When the first drops of rain fell, they both laughed, recognizing the same blessing that had graced every turning point of their family's history. Together, they carried the Foundation into a new era. Daniel's documentaries spread their message across continents, and Grace's quiet leadership turned inspiration into measurable change. They launched the Montgomery Global Fellowship, a program that brought young leaders from every background to learn not just management but empathy. Grace insisted that every fellow spend time in the field, far from boardrooms and air-conditioned offices. "You can't serve people you don't understand," she told them. Under her mentorship, those students went on to run clinics, reform education policies, and start charities of their own. Watching them grow filled Grace with a joy deeper than applause. "They are our children," she told Daniel one night. "Every dream we help rise is another heartbeat added to the world." Years passed, and technology transformed how the Foundation operated, yet Grace never let screens replace human contact. She still traveled to remote villages, still sat cross-legged with children, drawing pictures in the dirt, still knelt beside mothers planting the first seeds of new crops. In every act, she felt her parents' spirits walking with her. Sometimes, when exhaustion pressed heavy on her shoulders, she would return to the lake house, open her mother's old notebook, and read the words scrawled in fading ink. Maybe love doesn't begin with passion or choice. Maybe it begins with kindness. Those lines, once written by a frightened young bride, had become the creed of an entire generation. Decades later, when Grace grew older and the world around her glittered with the towers her foundation had helped design, she remained as humble as that girl who had once carried books through muddy streets. On her 70th birthday, she stood before thousands of volunteers gathered from every corner of the earth. Her hair was silver now, but her voice carried the same steady fire. "If you remember nothing else from me," she said, "remember this love is the only investment that never fails. My parents built this truth with their lives, and it belongs to all of you now." The crowd rose in a wave of applause, not for fame or power, but for the endurance of goodness. That night, she returned to the lake house alone. The air was cool, the sky clear, the water reflecting 1,000 stars. She sat on the old wooden bench where her father had once spoken of loneliness and her mother of courage. Closing her eyes, she whispered, "I kept the promise." And in the hush that followed, she could almost hear their voices, the calm of Isabella, the deep rumble of Ethan answering from somewhere beyond the veil. "We know our daughter. You turned our love into a world when dawn finally broke." The light touched the plaque by the porch, gleaming against the morning dew. "Love is the only wealth that grows when given away." The words seemed to breathe, alive as ever, carrying the Montgomery story forward into another century. In distant classrooms and crowded clinics, in the hearts of strangers helping strangers, their legacy lived on not as a fairy tale of riches, but as proof that kindness multiplied is the greatest fortune of all.